Welcome to MOOC course on Introduction to Proteogenomics. Today's lecture by Dr. David Fenio will talk about predictive analysis. He will provide a detailed information in supervised machine learning, how it is linked with predictive analysis. Dr. Fenio will briefly discuss various parameters which are important for how to train a model, how to test a predictive model. He will also talk to us about how predictive analysis can be used in treatment of cancer, especially in taking decision of treatment strategies. Dr. Fenio will also talk about image classification and how the image classification could be used for skin cancer diagnosis. So, let us welcome Dr. David Fenio for today's lecture.
Now we're going to talk about machine learning and specifically about predictive analysis. So so you heard Mani's lecture where he talked about unsupervised and supervised machine learning. So what we're going to talk about today is purely supervised. That means that you need a set of labeled data. So, I mean, Mani gave a very short introduction, and I will plan to go a little bit deeper and give you more details about this. So, what I would like to learn this morning is, first of all, how does one train a model? And there we're going to talk about gradient descent, which is a way to, a method, a quite general method to find the parameters of the model. Then we're going to talk about regularization, which is a method to protect us from overfitting. And we'll talk about all these terms in detail. The other thing we'll talk about is feature selection. So one thing that in proteogenomics is that we measure a lot of things. We measure, let's say, tens of thousands of transcripts, maybe 10,000 proteins, maybe 30,000 phosphorylation sites. So it's a lot of measurements on different molecules. But most of these will not be relevant to let's say, predicting what happens to a tumor. So what we want to do is focusing in on the important ones. And that's why we do feature selection. So we select out the genes that are important to and closely related to what we want to predict. Then we'll just briefly touch upon that, but people have developed a lot of different methods to machine learning and a lot of different approaches on how to do this. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to choose the right method for the problem that you want to solve. So that's another thing that's quite important. Then a very important thing is that then after we've trained our model, we need to test it. We need to evaluate how good it is and how well it generalizes. So and there we're going to talk about overfitting and underfitting. I showed this slide 2 days ago, and so this is one example of predictive modeling. So when for example, the surgeon cuts out the primary tumor, we analyze the primary tumor, let's say measure, we do RNA-seq and proteomics, and then we want to, from that measurement, build a predictive model that can tell the oncologist which combination of drugs to give cure the cancer. And this will of course depend on both the individual and the type of tumor that they have. So this just shows in one example, in top the treatment A is what we want, but for the individual in the lower panel we want the treatment B works much better. And because currently, as you probably know very well, that's not the case. I mean, there is some standard of care that's given to everyone, and it's only in a few specific cases where we can make these decisions. But of course, the hope is that by doing research in proteogenomics in the future, we will be able to make these kinds of decisions in a more general way. So you probably read in the newspapers that machine learning has improved a lot. So people have been working on machine learning for several decades, but the last few years it's really exploded and things work much better than it has in the past. So one thing that has been, for example, very successful is image classification. So like Google and Facebook, they have a lot of images, so they put large efforts into automatically annotating these images and classifying them. And it's actually amazing how well it works. And as you see, these are just, this is one big data set that's often used for this training. It's a very, very large variety of images, but also how easy it is to see what's in the images. So this has really become, so for several years they had competitions on who could develop the best algorithm to look at these images, but now they've actually given up on image classification competitions because it works too well. There's not worth doing much more. So they look at more complicated problems. But this is the general, and of course this we can apply in our field. And for example, so there was a Nature publication last year on the skin cancer diagnosis. So what the authors did was they had cell phone images of moles on people's skin. And then they had pathologists, dermatologists look at these images and classify them if they were benign or they were cancerous. And then they built, and they collected a lot of images. So it was, I think, close to 130,000. And then built a model with that, and then they could show that it actually, their machine learning model worked better than at least average pathologists. So that's, and that's quite incredible. I mean, you can imagine the implications if you can just, you're worried about some mole and you take a picture of it on your cell phone and upload it to some web service, and then you get an answer back right away with high accuracy. So another thing that has been very successful is teaching algorithms to play games. So quite a while ago, chess machines became very good at playing chess, and then became better than any human. But still, for a while there, if you had a collaboration between an algorithm and a person, that was better than any algorithm on its own. But that's not the case anymore. Now the human doesn't add anything extra in chess. And then more complicated games like Go has also become, and Jeopardy. The advantage in games, which we don't have in our case, is that if you can have slightly different algorithms play against each other, you can in general, you can generate as much training data as you want. Because in our case, we have a certain number of tumors that we analyze. And if we analyze more tumors, that's more expensive, so that's limited. But in the game case, it's only if you have large computers, you can have the algorithms play against each other and learn from these playing. So it's in principle generating any amount of training data. So that's something that people are trying to do in proteogenomics also, but it's dangerous, because there we have to then, if we want to generate more data, we have to model our data. We have to build some kind of model how our data behaves. And so that, of course, then the algorithm will probably mainly learn what we think the data looks like, and not really, not anything real. Another example that from the general thing is language translation. So this was in the New York Times 2 years ago. So this is a passage from Hemingway's Snows of Kilimanjaro, so one of them is the Hemingway's original. The other one was a Japanese translation by an author from English to Japanese, and then taking the Japanese translation and translating it back using Google Translator. So which is which? Yeah. So it's mainly the dead body of leopard. That's the main, and then there are maybe some other nuanced things, but there's only one small grammatical error. So this is quite amazing. So I'm just showing these general examples because as an inspiration that we should do the same for proteogenomics, to be able to do these kinds of things. But of course, as I said before, the advantage in all of these cases, both with image analysis, translation, and with games, is that there is a very large data set that's been labeled. So that's really what we need. And unfortunately, our data sets are usually limited, and and we would always want them to be larger to be able to achieve things like this. So let's look a little bit more at the details of supervised learning. So as Mani already mentioned, we have two main things. One is regression, other one is classification. So what supervised learning is we have a very general model with lots of parameters. Into this model, there is no biological knowledge. It's just a very generic, and we're going to look a little bit at what is. So it's just a generic model that can pretty much approximate any type of function, and then we want to learn the parameters that that best fit that. So we're going to look first at regression, and then what regression is that we have some variables that we measure. We call them x usually. So in this case, for illustration purposes, we only show one x-axis, and then we want to predict what the value y is. So x would be, for example, the level of a transcript that we measure with RNA-seq, or the level of a phosphorylation site that we measure with mass spectrometry. But with all data, we have actually many measurements. So even though I only show one measurement, you should always imagine that there are 10,000 axes or 100,000 axes. It's very difficult to imagine what that happens, and also it methods that work on low dimensions become things behave very different when you go to high dimensions. So what regression is that we pretty much try to, in this case, when we have one x and one y, we try to find the function that describes the relationship. It's quite straightforward that way. And in classification, we try to find the boundary between two classes. And so in this case, there are two measurements. So x1 would be, let's say, the level of one protein, x2 the level of another protein. And then we have, for example, the yellow circles could be that patients that have long survival, and the black ones, the patients that have short survival. And we want to find the boundary so we can classify when we've done the measurements, we can answer the question, will this patient survive for a short or a long time? And if we go back to the regression case, there we would the y could be instead how many months will this patient survive. So we're going to start with linear regression, and so here the x's, so we can have many x's, those are different measurements that we do, quantitative measurement, and then for each of them we have a different weight. And so what the output, the y, is we take each measurement and multiply its weight and sum that up and add a constant. And then, so that's, you recognize that if we have just one x as the linear regression case. So now one thing to point out that we can also have an arbitrary function of x. We don't just need, we don't have to limit ourselves to just using x, but we can, for example, have a polynomial that has an input as x. It's still linear regression because it's what linear regression. It's linear in the w, in the parameters that we are learning. So one thing is that we have limited data. We can build these models arbitrarily complex. What we can, but we have to choose how complex to make them. So in this case, if we have these data points, it could be pretty reasonable to draw, just have a linear regression. Not a very complex function, and that could work well. But one could also have a much more complex function, and then we would have the lower case.
Can you please give an example of some proteomic data for this linear regression?
Yeah, so maybe the output could be we want to predict how many months a person will survive. And then the input would be several different proteins, the levels of them, and then we can use that as to predict. And then what we want to learn are the weights.
So the analysis is, the result will get us for how long that person will survive.
Yes.
So what will be x1, x2, x3 and so on?
Oh, so x1, yeah, so x1 would be one protein, x2 would be another protein, and so on. So we would, and then we're going to talk about some, let's say we measure the levels of 10,000 proteins, but that's a lot of parameters. So we probably don't have enough samples to support such a complex model. So we're going to talk about how to select which proteins are important a little bit later. So we have these two cases. So which one is right, correct? Who wants to, please, who thinks the top one is correct? Please raise your hands. The answer is that there's no way to tell. Because if you only have your training data, there's no way to tell. I mean, yes, I agree. The top one is more likely. That's what we more would guess, but it's just a guess. It's really, we don't know. We need to collect more data, and so we need to always train on one data set and then test our model on an independent data set. So let's say that we measure more data, and these are now, so the black ones are the same as before, so we have the gray ones as our new independent test set. That will now we can say that we trust the linear regression. But for example, if for some reason this would happen when we do our, then we would choose the more complex model. But the main thing is that it's really, when you only have your training data set, there's no way to tell how good it is. And so that's probably the most important thing from my lecture here today. And another way to show this is here. Now we've on the, this is the same data set that those 12 points, I think it was. If we, and we see that when we increase the degree of the polynomial, so we increase the complexity, we can make the error go down, in this case, to 0 when we have the same degree polynomial as we have number of data points. So this is, so one thing about the error that and you're probably familiar with this, that we have to, of course, both for training and for testing, choose a function that we in training minimize, and then we in testing we use to evaluate. And for linear regression, anyone remembers what we use as this loss function? It's the sum, you take for each data point the distance to the line, and then you square the error, and then you take the sum of the square of the errors. You remember that from high school maybe? No. No, sum of square errors. Not, I mean, usually not, I mean, you can take the average, it doesn't matter, but you can, it's really usually just the sum of the, you take each error for each data point and then you sum them. It's simpler than that. It's just taking each error, taking the square, and then adding them up. That's the most common way. That's the SD. So square deviation. Yeah, you can do the mean, but you don't even have to do the mean. Just the square deviation. Yeah. So the sum of the square, yeah. You have to sum them, but you don't have to take the mean. Yeah. So it's very simple, and you all know this, I'm sure. So going back to here, so we know that in a training set, if we make our function complex, we can minimize, have the error go down to 0. But of course, this is meaningless because we just have made an overly complex fit to all the sort of noise that's in our training data. Because of this, a long time ago, Johnny von Neumann said that if you give him 4 parameters, he can fit an elephant to any data. And with 5, he can wiggle his trunk. So, so what he meant was just this, that if you train on, if you evaluate your model with your training data, that's not meaningful. And of course, this was a long time ago, so he had much less data. So he was worried about 4 parameters. Nowadays, when people build deep learning model, they have hundreds of thousands of parameters and worry much less than Johnny von Neumann.
I hope today you learned how supervised machine learning and regression and classification plays a role in predictive analysis. Dr. Fenio also showed how predictive analysis could help in skin cancer diagnosis and found to be superior when compared to pathology based diagnosis. We also learned that how overfitting or underfitting plays an important role in model capacity. Finally, we understood that the capacity of a model describes how complex a relationship it can model. You could expect a model with higher capacity to be able to model more relationships between more variables than a model with a lower capacity. In the next lecture, Dr. David Fenio will talk more about predictive analysis, giving more emphasis on training a model and testing a model. Thank you.